Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will about the fourth module of the Section 1 in the IBMS digital registration portfolio called Patient Records and Data Handling. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. We will discuss evidence justification and IBMS evidence suggestions. I will share with you some of my evidence ideas, and we will finish with some helpful tips to make your portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the 4RD module. These are the learning outcomes you should be able to meet when you have completed this module. You should be able to maintain confidentiality and comply with data governance requirements. You should be able to manage and keep clear, accurate, and detailed records in accordance with applicable legislation, protocols and guidelines. And you need to be able to adhere to specimen identification protocols, use systems for the accurate and correct identification of laboratory specimens and recognize the importance of backup storage of electronic data. When you complete this module, come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that you have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. And the task is, review a specific sample pathway, from receipt to result, explaining the importance of consent and confidentiality. So to break it down, first part is asking you to review a specific sample pathway. What this means is that you choose an appropriate sample, and its path through the lab. The second part of the task is asking you to start the path at the specimen reception and follow it all the way through to the result. This is very specific, which is helpful, so you could pick a sample when you are booking in, and then follow it through, until it reaches the result stage, which in histology department will be pathologist cert. Different disciplines might have different pathways, so keep that in mind. The last part of the task is asking you to explain the importance of consent and confidentiality. Find out what the consent is and why it is important. For this reason, I would also recommend that you choose a sample that comes in with the consent, if possible. In histopathology, we receive POC samples with consents that would be example for this evidence. Some departments also receive PM cases with consent forms, so that might be an option as well. You could annotate the consent and include it in your evidence. You need to highlight the importance of consent and confidentiality, so bear that in mind when you are writing the evidence. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. First information you are getting is telling you that this piece of evidence has to relate to the lab you are working in. So choose a sample received in your laboratory. Next part of the advice is asking you to clearly describe the sample pathway. Think about what exactly is happening to the sample as it goes through the different sections in the lab. Show your understanding of different sections of the lab, and what is happening to the sample in each of them. For histology, it would be dissection, processing, embedding, microtomy, staining, digital scanning, block checking and booking out to pathologist for reporting. The next part of the advice is letting you know about different forms in which you could present this piece of evidence. It could be a written piece, or a diagram, or a flowchart, or images, or a video, or an animation. Choose a form you will be happy to do. You can make it very personalized and make it your own. The next part is asking you about the consent, specifically how and when it is given. To meet this, you will have to find out how patients consent to procedures when they have their samples taken. In histopathology, if you chose the P sample, the sample is accompanied by a request form and the consent form, that is filled and signed by the patient. The consent form has a lot of very important information you can use in your evidence. I would strongly advise you to read the consent form carefully and understand it. You can then bring this knowledge into this piece of evidence. The last part of the advice is asking you to maintain confidentiality in this piece of evidence. Why is confidentiality important when it comes to patient samples, request forms and consent forms? Also, you will be following a real sample that was received into your laboratory. You might choose to include copies of request forms, consent forms, results and reports. Please, make sure the information is anonymized. And also include why this information is anonymized, the importance of confidentiality. This will show nicely your understanding. Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, adhere to the professional duty of confidentiality and understand when disclosure may be required. You could start with what is confidentiality, what is your duty when it comes to confidentiality, and how you decide when to disclose sensitive information. What situations require you to disclose such information? If you do share sensitive information, who do you share it with? What way of communication do you choose to share sensitive information? Why do you choose specific way of communication? How do you in your practice maintain confidentiality? Part of the mandatory training in many trusts is the subject of confidentiality. Have a look at it, see if you can use some information from there as well. Consider secure information, obtaining consent, limit disclosure, record keeping, professional scope and duty, legal requirement and exception, public safety, and reasons when disclosure would be required. Also consider consequences of non-compliance like disciplinary action, struck from register. The second standard is, understand the principles of information and data governance and be aware of the safe and effective use of health, social care and other relevant information. Again, I would start with what are the principles of information and data governance. Think along the lines of data management and its legal and ethical importance. Think accountability, transparency, compliance with laws and regulations like GDPR or Data Protection Act, Freedom of Information Act 2000, Caldecott principles. Think integrity and quality measures. Think availability, accessibility, retention, disposal, purpose limitations. Then relate it all to your own practice. How do you make sure you use health and care information safely and effectively? Bring in some specific examples from your practice. The third standard is, recognize that the concepts of confidentiality and informed consent extend to all mediums, including illustrative clinical records such as photography, video and audio recordings, and digital platforms. This standard needs you to recognize that the concept of confidentiality and consent extends to many different media patient information, including photography, video, audio recording or various digital platforms. How do you make sure all those mediums follow the principles of information and data governance? How does the trust and your department ensure this too? What other mediums are used in your laboratory, and how do they follow the principles of information and data governance? Consider obtaining explicit consent, storing digital data securely, duty of confidentiality, explaining use to patients, protected accessibility to media, compliant with laws and regulations, importance of anonymization, use and adherence to policies. The fourth standard is, use digital record-keeping tools, where required. This standard is asking you to use digital record-keeping tools, if it is required. First, what are the digital record-keeping tools? Where are you using them in your laboratory? Do you know how to use them appropriately? And how are applying with the principles of information and data governance? Consider LIMS systems, tracking systems like Vantage, imaging software, electronic copies of documents, Pulse, patient information portals like Spine or ICE, digital dictations, digital pathology, and so on. Those are the standards you have to keep in mind when writing your mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidates' choice evidence and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 10 HCPC standards. And if you download the module descriptors for the registration portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards that have to be met by those two pieces of evidence. The first standard is, adhere to the professional duty of confidentiality and understand when disclosure may be required. This standard is the same as the first standard in the mandatory evidence. So if you meet it in the mandatory evidence, it is not needed to be covered in the choice evidence. One standard less for you to worry about. The second standard is, recognize and respond in a timely manner to situations where it is necessary to share information to safeguard service users, carers, and/or the wider public. This standard requires you to recognize situations where it is necessary to share information to safeguard service users. So what are those situations? Consider situations when there is a clear risk of harm to service users, or when it is required by the law or court order. Key situations might be risk of harm, crime, public interest, statutory duty, incapacitated service user, patterns of abuse, risk posed by other professionals, coercion, during life-threatening emergencies, during child transitions in care, when there is a risk of neglect. Again, you can find more information in your mandatory safeguarding training. Don't be afraid to bring them in. This standard also needs you to be able to respond in timely manner to those situations. So think about the time frame. When do you respond? Consider being proactive, not waiting to be asked if abuse is suspected, being transparent, and the 7 golden rules, which are: understand data protection, seek consent, use professional judgment, sharing necessary information, seek advice, safety overrides privacy, and record decisions. Are there any guidelines in your trust or department you could follow if you needed to? Do you know who to speak to seek advice? Again, quite a lot of this is covered in your mandatory safeguarding training. The third standard is, understand the need to ensure confidentiality is maintained in all situations in which service users rely on additional communication support such as interpreters or translators. To meet this standard, you need to understand the need to maintain confidentiality in all situations where service users require additional communication support. Consider professional standards, code of ethics, use of qualified personnel like interpreters that are bound by the confidentiality agreements and legal requirements, and have appropriate training to handle sensitive information, creation of safe environment where service user can speak freely without fear. Consider clear protocols for qualified personnel like interpret state confidentiality agreements. Consider legal requirements and framework like GDPR. Consider accuracy and safety when using untrained interpreters like family members and friends. The fourth standard is, recognize that the concepts of confidentiality and informed consent extend to all mediums, including illustrative clinical records such as photography, video and audio recordings, and digital platforms. This standard is again same as the third standard in the mandatory evidence. So if you met it in the mandatory evidence, it is not needed to be covered in the choice evidence. Another standard less for you to worry about. The fifth standard is, keep full, clear and accurate records in accordance with applicable legislation, protocols, and guidelines. This standard requires you to keep a full, clear, and accurate records that reflect relevant legislations, protocols, and guidelines. First, find out what those legislations, protocol, and guidelines are, and what do they state when it comes to record keeping. Consider GDPR, Data Protection Act, Freedom to Information Act, Public Record Act, professional standards, and so on. Also consider reasons why the records need to be full, clear, and accurate, to ensure safe, effective, and continuous care, safeguarding, and accountability. Then find out the protocols and guidelines within your trust and department. What are they? Have a look at your information governance mandatory training that most trusts have in place. How do you follow these in your own practice? Consider recording relevant information promptly, legibly, accuracy and security, accessibility, confidentiality, completeness, legibility, and clarity. The sixth standard is, manage records and all other information in accordance with applicable legislation, protocols, and guidelines. This standard links very closely to the previous standard we just covered. It requires you to manage records in accordance with relevant legislations, protocols, and guidelines. First, out what those legislations, protocols, and guidelines are, and what do they state when it comes to record management. Think GDPR, Data Protection Act, Freedom to Information Act, Public Record Act, Health and Social Care Act. Then find out the key aspects of managing records. Consider data quality, secure, confidentiality, retention, disposal, and best practice. Also find out the record management guidelines within your trust and department. What are they? Have a look at your information governance mandatory training that most trusts have in place. Then state how you follow these in your own practice. Think along the lines of creation, use, maintenance, review, retention, archival, disposal or destruction of information. Link those to the legislations, protocols, and guidelines. The seventh standard is, recognize, communicate and understand the risks and possible serious consequences of errors and omissions in both requests for, and results of, laboratory investigations. To cover this standard, you need to be able to recognize, communicate and understand the risks and consequences of errors in laboratory investigations. Think about what those errors in laboratory investigations can be and where they can occur. Then link those errors to the consequences to the patient. For example, in histopathology we can place a tissue in the wrong cassette, or a section on a wrong slide that could completely change the diagnosis, leading to the wrong treatment. Consider pre-analytical, analytical and post-analytical risks errors. Also consider their consequences like patient harm, misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, mortality, litigation, or distress. Then think how your own practice prevents those errors. What quality measures does your department have in place to minimize errors? How do you follow those measures in your practice? Consider PID checks, electronic tagging of samples, communication, audits, ISO 15189, training, awareness, QMS and SOPs. The eighth standard is, use systems for the accurate and correct identification of service users and laboratory specimens. To demonstrate this standard, you need to be able to use systems that are in place to ensure accurate and correct identification of service users. What are those systems? How do you use them in your practice and why? Consider patient ID checks when booking in samples, patient demographics on the request form, LIMS system, types of samples received, sample labeling, barcoding or electronic tagging, sample traceability throughout the lab via tracking systems like Vantage, SOPs, training, sample acceptance policy, and so on. They are all very relevant here. The ninth standard is, understand the need to adhere to protocols of specimen identification, including barcoding and electronic tag systems. This standard links very nicely to the previous standard, where you talked about the systems for specimen identification and how you use them. This standard requires you to understand the need to adhere to them. In simple words, why do we need to follow them? What could happen if we did not follow them? What would be the consequences? Use some examples from your practice to demonstrate this standard. Consider the reasons for adhering to protocols of specimen identification like regulatory requirement, patient safety, diagnostic accuracy, timely treatment, preventing misdiagnosis, streamlining workflow, or cost reduction. Then consider the consequences of not adhering to those protocols like patient harm, misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, mortality, litigation, or distress to patients. The 10th standard is, understand the importance of backup storage of electronic data. This standard requires you to understand the importance of backup storage of electronic data. What backup storage does your lab use? Why is backup storage important? Consider protection of data, defense against ransomware, as business continuity. It is a legal requirement, in case of a human error via accidental deletion, cost-effective approach, maintains data security and integrity. Also consider potential risks of not backing up storage data like permanent data loss, theft, accidental deletion, affected service continuity, compromised safeguarding entity, legal implications and penalties, loss of public trust, financial and reputational damage. Always have those standards in your mind when you are selecting a piece of evidence and then when you are writing it. Bear in mind that those two pieces of evidence you choose have to together demonstrate all those 10 standards. Well, standards 6.1 and 6.5 need to be covered by mandatory evidence, so they might not need to be covered by your choice evidence. One more thing you have to include when choosing and writing your evidence. And that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want you to do that piece of evidence. I would strongly advise you to read their justifications, as this can form the basis for how to be justifying your choice of evidence. You should also include what standards you have met by your evidence. Think about what type of evidence you have chosen, then think why you have chosen that particular evidence, and think which standards you are meeting with that evidence as well. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as the choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good and can meet several standards, which is what you need. And these are a few ideas of types of evidences you could consider. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make your portfolio look really good. Try to present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs, or even videos, if you can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in specialist portfolios. Try to make it a little bit more interesting to the reader, which will be your training officer and eventually the verifier. Try to put yourself in their shoes. How would you like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share with you my evidence I used for my portfolio back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also try to use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each subsection. You could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of you performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and verification evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Try to bring in your personality. Think about the ways you like to learn best. If you like experimenting, perform experiment. If you like troubleshooting, perform troubleshooting. Choose something that demonstrates your understanding, knowledge, skills, and how you apply this in your practice. And one more thing, keep the competence requirements in mind when you selecting your evidence. Good evidence will tick off several requirements. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting and approaching your evidence. Bye for now.